Welcome to another episode of the Bleeding Edge of Digital Health. Really excited about today's guest. We've got Filip Peters here, CEO and the original founder of Acorai, which is a really exciting technology that is hoping to redefine the space of heart failure management. And a lot that can mean a lot of different things, which we're going to get into later in this episode. But Filip, just wanted to say thanks for joining us here today. I've been really excited about filming this episode. How are things going?
Yeah, thanks for having us, or having me, I suppose. Things are going well. It's a Tuesday, and I'm still alive, so can't complain.
There you go. There you go. And for the guests out there, where are you located?
So we are a global company at this point. I'm typically located in Sweden. We have an office in London as well, so I'm currently in the London office working with the machine learning team on analyzing the data that's coming through to our study. So always somewhere else, it seems.
Yeah, yeah. Well, really exciting technology. I know it's worth mentioning that you guys just wrapped up your seed round. I think it was a $4 million seed round. So congrats to you and the team. That is quite an accomplishment in any environment, but certainly in this environment, that goes without saying that took a lot of hard work. Congratulations, and excited to see how you guys put the money to work. That's fantastic. So congrats again.
Thank you. Thank you.
Yeah. So let's as we always do on this show, we usually like to kick the show off. Just have you kind of just tell the origin story. You know, there's that's people love to know how the sausage is made. What the genesis of these exciting technologies and companies were. So if you can just share a little bit, without getting um, too far into the tech, just kind of what was the inspiration for creating the company?
I think like most entrepreneurial journeys, it starts with a healthy dose of naivety, thinking you can do stuff that others have thought you can't do. I come from a background in finance. I used to develop machine learning methods and algorithms within finance. And I had the opportunity to kind of look at the medtech industry, and I thought that, hey, I could probably look at some time series data in there and see what could be accomplished. So I started doing that. I became aware of the problem of non-invasive intracardiac pressure monitoring, or the lack of non-invasive intracardiac pressure monitoring. And I'm sure we'll get into that later of why that's important. But I think what I was able to do was kind of have a really fresh perspective on what could be tried in terms of combining hardware and software at the same time, and solving this problem. There were a whole lot of things that hadn't been tried yet within the cardiac space that had been tried in other industries, primarily oil and gas industry and kind of engine diagnostics when it comes to solving this very problem. And that's what I started doing, playing around with different hardware prototypes, building together different prototypes, analyzing data from a number of different laboratory experiments with machine learning methods that are quite common to the finance industry in terms of analyzing time series data, and then seeing some pretty interesting initial results. And that, I think, coupled with excitement from the clinical community about the early prototypes we were building, just kind of led to a snowball effect. And 4 years later, here we are, right? But it's been a chaotic process to get to where we are. I would still say it's still pretty chaotic, but yeah, that's pretty much
Yeah.
it.
What was there? Usually people that come from outside the industry and make a play in healthcare, they usually have some sort of event where, did you have a family member that had heart failure? What was it that kind of piqued your interest in potentially trying to parlay some of your AI skill sets into this space specifically?
Yeah, so I think I come from a family that's overexposed to medtech entrepreneurship, particularly when the cardiac space. So, both my father, my uncle, and my cousins are all kind of in medtech. So, I've certainly been exposed to this industry a lot, and I thought, looking at it from the outside, I thought that machine learning in general was kind of underutilized, it seemed. And again, going back to my naivety, it's kind of, I thought I could do something better, right? And that's what I set out to do.
Yeah. Yeah. I always say, well, it's interesting that, there's always a connection to healthcare. People don't just wake up one day and go, you know what, I'm going to pivot into healthcare. I'm going to give that a try. There's always a connection there. And that's why I kind of peeled the onion back a little bit, because um, we don't pick this space because it's easy, right? I always say technology always disrupts the regulated spaces last for a reason, because
Yeah.
they're very hard. And you left one regulated space in finance and jumped to another one, so you're a glutton for punishment, as they say, huh?
Yeah.
but but yeah, no, and to that point, because these spaces, these regulated spaces, are always the last to get disrupted. um that's why I think we're starting to see so much disruption on the machine learning front and on the AI front, because that there's other industries that are still running with those modalities, but I think it's interesting to see how it's bled into healthcare, and finance to a certain extent, um, later than some of the other stages. So that makes perfectly good sense. What's the what's the use case you guys are what's the problem you guys are trying to solve? Heart failure, I mean, we could go through the statistics. I think it's got to be one of the most, the highest in terms of total spend on managing those patients. So there's and it's just an undermanaged disease state. But what's that one or two things that you guys identified as, if we could solve this, this would be a win for the system?
Yeah. Yeah. So to your point, heart failure, extremely complex to manage, and it's extremely difficult, even for heart failure experts, to truly understand what's going on with our patients. What we do know, and what's been known for decades, is that managing your heart failure patients with the aid of the intracardiac pressures, we can focus on the pulmonary artery pressure, for example. And for the audience that doesn't live and breathe, cardiovascular disease, the intracardiac pressures are effectively the blood pressures inside the heart.
Yep.
And they're one of the earliest and most sensitive signs of cardiac function in heart failure patients. So if we can detect changes early enough, we can intervene much more proactively and help avoid and improve outcomes for a lot of these patients. What's really neat about the space is that this has been proven out in a number of studies, and it's been shown to increase and improve outcomes for heart failure patients. So just by giving access to these pressures to managing cardiologists or nurses or hospitalists, they've been able to show that heart failure readmissions go down, heart failure mortality rates go down, and to your point, overall costs go down as well. The issue that remains, however, is that all existing solutions on the market are implantable, which is fine for remote monitoring markets when you're trying to manage the patient at home. But when it comes to the in-hospital workflow, it is you can't just put a sensor into every person that arrives in the hospital, right? So in the hospital, there is this unmet need for a tool that can help these cardiologists and nurses better understand these patients and help them manage these patients much more efficiently. So what we believe that we can help hospitals accomplish is not just reducing the cost of these patients by reducing length of stay, potentially reducing erroneous discharge decisions, shifting kind of workflow productivity from cardiologists to nurses, but then also avoiding complications. And that will, by extension, also help improve outcomes for these patients. So it's a win for patients, and it's a win for hospitals at the same time. And that's why we think we have something really cool here.
Yeah. And for the audience out there that's not aware of why this is so difficult to manage, it's unless you really have a tangible, objective data point, to your earlier comment about the intracardiac pressures, you don't know what's going on with these patients because they don't ever feel great.
Yeah.
They, and they fuck their state of being fluctuates massively day to day. Um, you know, are they in heart failure, or did they just eat too much salt and drink too much alcohol the day before? And these patients, obviously you're addressing the inpatient subset, but these doctors, it's a nightmare to manage them because they get phone calls all day long from these heart failure patients and they have no clue, you know aside from being able to bring them into the office, and then their calendar gets flooded with appointments that are potentially unnecessary. The only other option is to refer them over to the ER or send them to urgent care or whatever. And there's not a there's a with aside from putting an implantable in somebody or a solution like what you're talking about, there's really just no way to know whether they're in heart failure or not, whether they just need to bump up their Lasix or their LASIK or one of the other diuretics. So and it's challenging for the patient too, because they're calling the office. They can't get an appointment that day. Doctor can't see them. They don't know, do I go to the ER? Do I not go to the ER? It is, in terms of workflow, it's got to be the most mismanaged subset of patients that we have in our system right now. So anything that can aid in improving that system will be very widely appreciated by the community, and it's exciting that you guys have something as compelling as you do. Let's jump into the tech. Talk a little bit about the tech. I don't know if you have a device there with you that you could show, but would love to just kind of get into. It's a unique form factor, so maybe tell us a little bit about how you settled on that form factor, and a little bit more about the tech itself.
It's kind of feels and works like a smartphone. And this is sort of the backside of it. So this is what we call the S.A.V.E sensor system. S.A.V.E is really just an acronym to help us remember the types of technologies that we use. And I think I mentioned earlier, we've borrowed heavily from other industries to come up with the combination of sensors for this device. I think when we looked at what had been tried in this space before, like many products within the cardiovascular space, there was a focus on ultrasound to do it, right? And is a very common tool to use, but for this particular purpose, it doesn't work very well. There's a number of issues with both inter and intraoperative variability. There's issues with repeatability of experiments, and then there's issues with turbulent flow that's typically present in many of these patients. So we again looked at the oil and gas industry, we looked at the engine diagnostics industry, and what's been tried in that space when it comes to non-invasive assessment of pressures and fluid, primarily in pipelines, is that you've leveraged a lot of seismic sensors. So using highly sensitive accelerometers and gyroscopes to detect surface vibrations. We applied a similar approach to our device. So we're detecting very small chest wall vibrations on the surface of the skin that emanate from within the heart. That's the S in the S.A.V.E sensor system. The A in the S.A.V.E is our acoustic sensors. So in this case, we have effectively built our own stethoscopes that are focusing in on some very specific frequencies. We have found that the traditional frequencies of sort of the heart beating are much lower than what the intracardiac pressures tend to have detectable signals at. So we're at a slightly higher frequency range, and that helps us detect what's interesting from a pressure perspective. Whereas traditional, I think, auscultation focuses more on kind of the beating of the heart, right? The V and the S.A.V.E are visual sensors. So we have PPG sensors placed on multiple parts of the body, which in combination with our ECG sensors allows us to approximate pulse transit time, which we know is a known correlate of the pulmonary artery pressures. So that's sort of the raw sensor technology that goes into the device. The next step is looking at the software side and the machine learning side. And I think the way we come at this from a novel approach is that we we don't do much traditional signal processing. So again, the history of kind of cardiac monitoring is that you will typically create some kind of waveform using signal processing to um, then show to an expert. So cardiologists will look at the waveform and say, "Hey, that's good, that's bad. Let's do this and that," right? But there are, of course, limits to our pattern recognition as humans. And what we decided to do is just look at the raw data straight away. So we take all of this raw data from more than 10 individual sensors. We put that into our machine learning models that have been now trained on thousands of measurements versus the clinical gold standard, which is a right heart cath procedure.
Mm-hmm.
And we're then able to uncover patterns in that data, which then allows us to estimate these intracardiac pressures directly. We're primarily focused on the pulmonary artery diastolic pressure as part of our clinical study now. That's our primary efficacy endpoint that we're going after. But we are looking at exploring other intracardiac hemodynamic parameters further down the line to give cardiologists and nurses as much information as possible about their patients.
What would some of those? Well, I guess yeah. What would some of the other pressures that you'd be looking at and other applications for the technology be?
So the pressures that we're, or the intracardiac hemodynamic parameters that we're collecting now is effectively anything you get from a right heart catheterization procedure. So that's wedge pressure, the pulmonary artery pressures, right atrial pressure, cardiac output, PVR, et cetera. Right. So there's a whole bunch of interesting parameters that are in there. It's just about sifting through that wealth of data that we've collected now, and finding out what patterns are actually there to see what we can offer in the future.
Yeah, no, that's neat. What 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 what's the workflow for this? So this would ultimately potentially replace an ultrasound or potentially replace a right heart cath. What what's the workflow for this? I'm guessing that this was designed so that a hospitalist could just keep this in their pocket as they're rounding their patients. Is it that simple that they could just use
That's
this
that's
as
the
opposed to
that's the
sending them?
first thing they do, right? They,
Yep.
they will, like we say, non-invasive intracardiac pressure monitoring. Their eyes kind of glare up, and then they take the device and they make sure it fits into the lab coat pocket. That's
Yep.
sort of, so that was our kind of design requirement from a size perspective, which I think is a lot higher than what the traditional wearables tend to do, which tends to be very minimized, right? So
Right.
that was one of our relatively simple insights as a company, was that the form factor can be a lot larger than we think, and the price can also be a lot larger, which allows us to have much more sophisticated sensors. Yeah, so in terms of the workflow, right, we are not intending to replace a right heart cath, and we are not intending to replace an echo. We are intending to fill that existing gap where echo and right heart caths can't be, right? So you, by definition, can't put a catheter into a patient every day to check their pressure, right? It's just too expensive and it's just not safe. So I think really for the first time in history, we are going to be able to offer cost-effective and non-invasive temporal assessment of the intracardiac pressures, which has the potential to really redefine the way that we manage these patients.
Yeah.
But I think crucially, it will allow cardiologists to see how these patients are responding to medication, um, not on a minute by minute basis, which arguably you don't need, but at least every few hours if they want to. And then over a few days, you'll see that trend start to materialize, and that will give you so much more information about your patients. I think secondly, it's about sort of that decision-making process of figuring out, all right, which patients can we perhaps move from an ICU unit down to the general cardiac ward, for example, or which patients can we discharge a day early and still feel confident that they're not going to come back with a readmission, right? So it's those kind of decisions that we think the information coming from our device can help these healthcare professionals make.
Yeah. No, I mean, that's very impactful. One, so if let's say like a patient got admitted and they had a right heart cath on day one, right? They came in, they got a right heart cath, they get a baseline, and then they can measure in perpetuity. in relation to that with this device and don't have to send that patient back before they discharge them to go get a right heart cath or whatever. Yeah, and that's where, if you're going to bring out a new technology in today's market, it's got to meet two criteria in my mind. There's got to be a clear clinical value proposition, and there's got to be an economic value proposition. And for these hospitals, they get paid on performance now. So if you can discharge the patient early and not have readmissions, because the readmissions is what really, and these patients are famous for being readmitted into the hospital. If you can drive that kind of economic value, you've got an incredible story to tell on the market.
Yeah, no, I mean, and I think that's why cardiologists are so excited about this. It's that they immediately see the value that this can bring to their patients, and then by extension, because these are predominantly Medicare and Medicaid patients, right? They don't make the hospitals a whole lot of money, so the incentive is to, all right, let's get them out of the hospital as quickly as possible with the best care as possible, without risking a readmission, right? And I think for us, that's why we like the U.S. market so much, is that the incentives are perfectly aligned for disruption in the heart failure management market, and that's why we're coming after the U.S. market first, and not our home market, which technically is Europe, right? So
yeah, no, it makes perfectly good sense. And our system rewards technologies that are aligned with that. So I do anticipate that you guys will be met with great success. That's a great segue. Where is it at in terms of the regulatory hurdles here in the U.S. and whatnot?
yeah, so we were granted our FDA breakthrough device designation in August of last year, and then shortly thereafter we joined the TAP program, which has been a fantastic pilot program so far. And we've had my first interaction with the FDA a few years back was almost traumatic, I would say. So what we have now is actually quite a congenial and collaborative process with the FDA. We can engage with them every 2 or 3 weeks on different sprint topics, and they have been super helpful in terms of guiding amendments to our clinical study protocol, figuring out what kind of endpoints we want, indications for use, and all that kind of stuff. So we're currently running clinical studies. So we have about 700 patients enrolled so far, and we're looking to have 1,500 patients enrolled towards the second half of this year. And based off of that data, we will have the data that needed to submit to the FDA, and that will be for a de novo grant application, which we'll submit towards the end of this year. And then, if all goes well, we'll hopefully be on the market by 2025.
That's exciting. That's really exciting. So, I want to be respectful of your time and get you out of here as promised. But so I always like to ask, you got a big bolus of cash. What lies ahead? What's the you guys have had a ton of success thus far. What's the one thing that keeps you up at night? What's the one thing that you're going to put that money to work with moving forward? What's the biggest challenge you see at this point that you're focused on?
God, where do I even start, right? I think fundraising is always a big topic for me as a CEO, right? It's top of mind. And while
We're always raising, right?
We're always raising, and U.S. clinical studies for some reason tend to cost a gazillion times more than European studies, right? So it's they sure know how to charge us. No, I think the remaining things we have to prove out as a company, right, are exactly what the FDA is looking for, right? It's at the end of the day, does this work in a U.S. population as well as it has in a European one, right? And there's no reason for us to believe that it doesn't. We have taken every precautionary measure, both from a hardware design and AI bias perspective, to make sure that this is going to work as well on a patient in, say, Kentucky as it will in Stockholm in Sweden. And we think we've covered those risks fairly well. But it's whenever you're doing something new that no one has done before, there was always those unknown unknowns that could pop up. So while I do sleep better now as we've closed our round, there's always new things that pop up into my mind about what I should be worrying about.
Yeah,
But things are moving fast, and we'll every month as we get new data and we find out more, and it's looking good so far. So we're quietly confident that we'll be able to meet our deadlines for submission towards the end of the year, and hopefully start treating patients or helping healthcare professionals manage patients sometime next year.
that's fantastic. Well, couldn't be more excited about what you guys are building, and definitely excited to follow you guys and watch the journey. And hopefully you guys will get the approval, and maybe we can get you back on the show when you guys are kicking off the US launch, and we can do an update. But really appreciate you joining us today, and we'll definitely look forward to catching up with you soon.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks so much for having me.
Absolutely. That's it for this edition of the Bleeding Edge of Digital Health. I look forward to catching you guys on the next episode.